Hidden camera catches cheating wife. DNA test leads to ultimate revenge. Landon Barrett had always been a man of meticulous planning and precision. His life was a carefully orchestrated symphony of structure, both in the professional and personal spheres. He thrived on predictability, his ability to anticipate challenges and adapt accordingly earning him respect in his career and a sense of stability at home. Despite the demands of his job, he had managed to cultivate a harmonious rhythm with his wife, Evelyn. Together, they shared a life that was organized, reliable, and, on the surface, enviable. But beneath the polished exterior of their marriage lay subtle cracks, unspoken tensions, fleeting moments of connection, and the quiet compromises that accumulate over time. Their communication, though methodical and efficient, was often reduced to the exchange of itineraries and schedules, a system that served them well but was not immune to the weight of unforeseen circumstances. It was a Thursday morning when Landon's well-ordered world began to unravel. He was on a business trip, as he often was, and had left behind his usual detailed itinerary for Evelyn. In return, she had kept him informed of her schedule, a system they had perfected over the years. But this time, something felt off. The deal he had been negotiating concluded earlier than expected, freeing him up by 11 a.m. His clients, facing a crisis at their East Coast operations, had departed abruptly, leaving Landon with unexpected time on his hands. Originally scheduled to return on Saturday night, he decided to head back early, changing his flight to Seattle. While in the air, Landon tried to inform Evelyn of his change of plans. Unable to reach her at home, he called her office instead. The receptionist answered, but her response unsettled him. Evelyn's assistant Rachel was out, and Evelyn herself was unavailable, a rarity. Evelyn had told him she'd be in the office all day, yet both she and her assistant were missing. The inconsistency nagged at him, but he brushed it off as a coincidence. By the time his flight landed, the sense of unease had grown. He arrived home around 6:30 p.m. to find the house dark. Evelyn, who was typically home by 6 p.m., was nowhere to be seen. Shrugging off his travel fatigue, Landon unpacked, grabbed a quick dinner, and settled in to wait. By 8 p.m., his concern deepened. Calls at Evelyn's cell phone went straight to voicemail, a sign her phone might be off. Pacing the house, he ran through possible explanations, perhaps a work emergency or an unavoidable delay. Still, the silence gnawed at him. Finally, at 9:20 p.m., Evelyn called. Her voice carried a mix of relief and concern. She explained that she had called his hotel and, learning he had checked out, grew worried. Landon reassured her, explaining his early return. Evelyn, on her end, shared news of her triumph at work, a promising step toward partnership at her firm, secured through her efforts on a challenging account. Despite her upbeat tone, something in her words felt faintly guarded, a nuance that didn't escape Landon. Evelyn promised to celebrate once he returned Sunday, as planned. Their conversation ended on a warm note, but as Landon hung up, the undercurrent of unease remained. Something in the day's events felt off kilter, like a puzzle missing a critical piece. Landon sat quietly after the brief call, replaying Evelyn's words in his mind. Her excuses felt hollow, and the lies gnawed at him. Until that moment, he had never doubted their marriage, believing their bond was unshakable. Now, doubt was all he could feel. His stomach churned, and unfamiliar bitterness settled over him. He went to bed late, unable to silence his racing thoughts. Tossing and turning, the emptiness of the bed Evelyn once called too big felt heavier than ever. By morning, his resolve hardened. Something wasn't right. By 9 a.m., he was convinced she wasn't coming home that day. He called her office, but the receptionist's cheerful response that Evelyn would be back Monday only deepened his suspicions. Determined to uncover the truth, Landon rummaged through Evelyn's Rolodex, noting down an address. He left their familiar Mercedes in the garage and took their little-used SUV, a vehicle few would recognize. Driving first to her office, he confirmed her car wasn't there before heading to the address tied to Paul, a name Evelyn had mentioned more than once. The address led him to an exclusive neighborhood in Medina, the kind of place tucked behind high brick fences and towering fir trees. Passing by slowly, Landon spotted Evelyn's gray BMW parked neatly by the garage. His heart sank, pulling over down the street. He sat gripping the wheel, his vision blurred as he tried to steady his emotions. Unable to stay yet unwilling to go far, he drove into Bellevue for a late breakfast. Picking at a Belgian waffle, he found little comfort in the food, his appetite lost to the whirlwind of his thoughts. After finishing, he drove aimlessly for hours, repeatedly passing by Paul's house. Each time, Evelyn's car was still there, a cruel confirmation of his fears. By the time he returned home, the day felt like a haze of pain and unanswered questions. He couldn't bring himself to cook and instead snacked absent-mindedly, trying to distract himself. At 9:45 that night, Evelyn called again. Her tone was cheerful and light. She complained about the lonely bed, but Landon's curt response, "You don't know how lonely it can be," left her momentarily confused. He quickly brushed it off, but the weight of his words lingered. He ended the call quietly, telling her, "I've loved you more than my own life," before retreating to another restless night. By 8 a.m. the next morning, Landon sat in the darkened living room, blinds drawn, waiting. At almost 10 o'clock, he heard her BMW pull into the garage. Moments later, Evelyn walked in, carrying a small overnight bag. She looked fresh, her plaid skirt and sleeveless red blouse immaculate. The Tahitian pearl necklace he had given her shimmered under the dim kitchen light. Her steps slowed as she noticed the kitchen in disarray. The sink full of dishes, the teapot still warm on the stove. Her gaze darted around the shadowy room, her unease growing. Dropping her bag on a dining chair, she moved cautiously, inspecting every corner. Reaching the fireplace, she grabbed the poker and turned sharply, her eyes scanning the darkened living room. Landon sat silently in his chair, watching her with a mix of pain and resignation. His presence was only revealed when he raised his teacup for a sip. Evelyn froze, startled by the quiet figure in the shadows. "Landon, you scare me." "When did you get back?" she stammered, her voice unsteady. His response came slowly, heavy with emotion. "A couple of days." Evelyn's knees buckled, and she sank into a chair across from him, her face pale with shock. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you call? Where have you been?" Landon's tone was flat and detached. "I did. Thursday afternoon. You weren't home, and you weren't at the office. Rachel wasn't there either." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I was here, sitting in this chair, when you called. I spent the night in that big, lonely bed you talked about." The room fell quiet again, save for muffled sounds from outside. A car passing, kids arguing, a dog barking. Inside, Evelyn's soft sobs broke the silence. Landon took another sip of tea before continuing. "I don't think the bed you were in Thursday and Friday nights was very lonely. Care to explain? Help me understand what happened." Evelyn's tears fell freely now as she buried her face in her hands. "Landon, I love you. This had nothing to do with us. Please try to see that. It was something I felt I had to do. It doesn't change how I feel about you." His voice hardened. "That makes no sense. How could betraying me have nothing to do with us? What does that even mean?" "It wasn't about you," she whispered through her tears. "It was about repaying Paul for everything he did for me, for us. It wasn't about my love for you." Landon sat unmoving, watching her crumble. After a long silence, he stood, refilled his cup in the kitchen, and returned. "So tell me," he said evenly, "why you felt this debt to Paul justified breaking your vows. Did he coerce you? Did he ask for this?" "No," Evelyn exclaimed, her voice cracking. "He didn't ask for anything. He helped me because he believed in me. He's honorable. He never expected this." Landon's brow furrowed. "So he didn't ask. He didn't suggest it. You offered. Is that what I'm hearing?" "You're twisting this," she said desperately. "It wasn't like that. It wasn't cheap or meaningless. I owed him. It wasn't about you." Landon's voice turned softer, but no less pained. "Do you hear yourself, Evelyn? You're telling me it wasn't tawdry, that it wasn't meaningless, yet it was something you gave freely to another man. You say it wasn't about me, but how could it not be? You gave the one thing that was most precious to me. How do you reconcile that?" Evelyn choked back a sob. It didn't mean anything. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Landon stared at her, his heart breaking with every passing second. The life they had built together, the trust they had shared, now lay in ruins. And as he sat there, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on him, he realized that no amount of planning or precision could ever repair what had been broken. Landon Barrett stood on the patio of his home, the cool evening air brushing against his face as he stared out at the faint glimmer of Lake Washington visible through the trees. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, confusion, and a deep, aching sorrow. Just hours earlier, he had confronted his wife, Evelyn, about her infidelity. Her tearful explanations and hollow declarations of love had done little to ease the pain. Now, as he stood alone in the dim light, he tried to make sense of the shattered pieces of their marriage. Evelyn's voice echoed in his mind. "Landon, I'm still the same. I love you. I'm yours." Her words had cracked with emotion, but to Landon, they felt empty. He had turned to her, his own voice trembling as he responded, "Evelyn, nothing stays the same. Every choice we make changes us. And you," he paused, struggling to steady himself, "you just spent 2 nights in another man's bed, sharing things that were meant to be ours alone. Do you really think that doesn't change anything?" Evelyn's cries had deepened, her words faltering as she tried to explain herself. "Landon, please. I love you. It didn't change how I feel." But Landon shook his head, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Love isn't just a feeling, Evelyn. It's loyalty, trust, and respect. And right now, I'm struggling to find any of those in what you've done." The conversation had continued, but Landon's heart grew heavier with each passing moment. Eventually, he rose from his chair, placing his teacup on the hearth before retreating to the dining room. He stared out into their sunny, well-kept backyard, a stark contrast to the dark turmoil inside the house. His thoughts spilled out in a low, controlled voice, frustration and sorrow interwoven. He admitted to himself that he wanted to lash out, to release the raw, unfiltered emotions that threatened to consume him. The idea of confronting Paul Reading, the man Evelyn had betrayed him with, filled him with dread. He knew it would only worsen the situation. Landon wondered aloud if Paul now viewed Evelyn as easily accessible. His respect for her likely diminished. The thought sickened him. His despair was clear as he acknowledged the monumental effort it would take to repair their relationship. Rebuilding trust would demand time, patience, and commitment, things he wasn't sure either of them could give. He proposed a physical separation within their home, suggesting they replace their shared bed with 2 smaller ones to create space for reflection. It was a small step towards salvaging what remained of their marriage, but Landon doubted whether Evelyn was truly willing to try. Stepping out onto the patio, he left Evelyn sobbing inside, unsure if their relationship could withstand the damage. His final words lingered in the air, a faint glimmer of hope amid the devastation. "I love you despite it all." 8 months later, Landon found himself sitting in a chic Portland restaurant on a Friday evening. The strains of his crumbled marriage had rippled into his professional life, souring his once strong career. His firm, oblivious of the depth of his personal crisis, had pressured him to take on a critical troubleshooting task shortly after the confrontation with Evelyn. He had refused, prioritizing his failing marriage over professional ambitions. Despite promises of promotion and veiled threats involving his rival, Eddie Rivera, Landon had stood his ground. When his refusal reached the firm's CEO, Landon made his stance clear with biting humor. He mocked their attempt to manipulate him, sarcastically blessing Rivera's chances of success and dismissing the firm's petty tactics. His final act was to resign, severing ties with a company that had become another source of disillusionment in his life. With his career behind him and his marriage in tatters, Landon was left to piece together a future from fragments of his past. He had indeed left his previous position and now served as a marketing director and chief troubleshooter at Fin Systems Incorporated, a company directly competing with Chapman Electronics. His move to Fin was no coincidence. He had deliberately chosen the firm to position himself against Chapman, whose president, Victor Chapman, had grown desperate enough to request a meeting with him. Over the past several months, Landon had systematically outmaneuvered Chapman Electronics, poaching clients and underbidding contracts to the point where the company was struggling to stay afloat. Layoffs and potential facility closures loomed. Victor Chapman, recognizing the existential threat, was prepared to make Landon an offer to stop the losses and bring him onto his team. Landon, however, had his own plans for how the evening would unfold. The two men exchanged pleasantries over dinner, carefully avoiding the real purpose of their meeting until after the plates were cleared. Then Chapman got straight to the point. He acknowledged Landon's impact on his business, describing the damage in stark terms. Hiring Landon, he argued, wasn't just about improving Chapman Electronics. It was about survival. To sweeten the deal, he offered Landon the role of Vice President of Marketing and Business Development, his second in command. "Name your price," Chapman concluded. Landon listened calmly, taking a sip of his wine before responding. He slid an envelope across the table, detailing his terms for compensation and authority. While the document was comprehensive, Landon added that there was one more condition, something not outlined in the paperwork. He wanted Chapman to listen to his story, uninterrupted, all the way to the end. Intrigued and willing to do whatever it took, Chapman agreed. Months earlier, Landon had stood on his patio, staring out at the faint glimmers of Lake Washington through the trees. His mind raced as he tried to process the catastrophic blow Evelyn had dealt to their marriage. Her sobbing, incoherent attempts to explain her betrayal had offered no clarity, leaving him to navigate the wreckage alone. In the face of her silence, he defaulted to what he knew best, problem-solving. He treated the crisis like a business challenge, outlining a tentative plan. He proposed they stay under the same roof, work on rebuilding communication, and sleep separately in the meantime. It was a stopgap approach, a way to regain some control in a situation that felt utterly chaotic. But as soon as he stepped outside to think, doubts crept in. This wasn't a business problem with straightforward solutions. It was their marriage, and it had been fundamentally broken for years. Their relationship had been built on trust and shared faith in one another. Evelyn's betrayal had shattered both. Her insistence that her actions meant nothing and her hollow declarations of love only deepened his despair. A woman he had always admired for her intelligence and insight now seemed incapable of grasping the damage she had done. Each lie, each evasion, chipped away at the foundation of their relationship, and Landon couldn't help but wonder what other truths she was hiding. He had told her they might get through this if they worked hard enough, but even as he said it, he wasn't sure it was possible. His love for her, once unwavering, had been eroded by her actions and the lingering uncertainty of how deep the betrayal ran. As he stood alone on the patio, the enormity of their situation hit him. Trust, once broken, might never be fully restored. And love, no matter how strong, had its limits. Landon was no lawyer, but he remembered a fundamental legal principle: false in one thing, false in all things. It suggested that if a witness was caught lying about one material fact, their entire testimony could justifiably be disregarded. Evelyn's actions and words had embodied this principle to its fullest. She had lied so often and so completely that every claim she made now seemed suspect. Her betrayal had left him feeling dishonored and disoriented, but what troubled him most was her inability or unwillingness to grasp the gravity of what she had done. She had given herself to another man, not under coercion or confusion, but willingly, and when pressed for explanations, her defense was hollow. It didn't mean anything. It wasn't about you or us. I felt I had to do it. These words, devoid of remorse, left him reeling. Evelyn's lack of accountability only deepened his despair. Without recognizing the harm she had inflicted, how could she ever work to repair it? Her tears and visible distress felt more like a reaction to being caught than genuine regret. She hadn't apologized or acknowledged the betrayal as fundamentally wrong, and that absence of remorse turned Landon's pain into growing doubt. He thought he knew Evelyn, ambitious, intelligent, and resilient. She had always been someone who could regroup after setbacks. But her greatest strength, her sharp mind and relentless drive, now posed a threat. She was shifting into litigator mode, a persona that thrived on deflection and defense. She would analyze every detail, looking for loopholes, reinterpreting facts to her advantage, and finding ways to avoid admitting fault. It was a strategy that worked in courtrooms but would devastate their already fragile marriage. Landon was not a jury to be persuaded. He was her husband, someone who had been deeply wronged, until she acknowledged her wrongdoing and showed true remorse. He couldn't see a path forward. From his seat on the patio, Landon watched Evelyn through the window. Her tears had stopped, replaced by a look of determination. She moved purposefully around the house, opening curtains and letting sunlight flood the rooms. As she sat by the window, her face set with resolve, Landon could almost hear her thoughts. She was reviewing every word exchanged since Thursday night. When her lies first became clear, she was preparing for battle, strategizing her next move. Landon's heart sank further. He could see her mind working, not on reconciliation, but on crafting a defense. What he needed from her, a sincere admission of guilt, was unlikely to come. Every moment she spent scheming chipped away at his hope, and, with it, another piece of the love he still clung to. Evelyn's sudden movement caught his attention. She picked up the cordless phone, glancing outside as if sensing his gaze. Then she disappeared into the dining room, out of his line of sight. Suspicion surged within Landon. He walked to the patio phone, positioned discreetly out of view. When he picked up the receiver, he didn't hear a dial tone or dialing. She hadn't yet connected the call. Acting quickly, he unscrewed the mouthpiece and disabled the microphone, ensuring she wouldn't be able to transmit her voice. He pulled out his cell phone, a high-tech model with advanced features, and switched it to record, holding it against the earpiece of the patio phone. He prepared to capture whatever conversation Evelyn was about to have. If she was calling Paul Reading or anyone else, he would know. This moment wasn't about spying for its own sake, but about seeking the truth she had been so reluctant to share. Evelyn's actions had forced him into this corner, and he was determined to uncover the reality behind her betrayal, no matter how painful it might be. As Landon listened, Evelyn's voice came through the line, followed by the sound of rapid speed dialing. A man answered after a couple of rings, his tone casual, but Evelyn immediately interrupted him, her voice tense and hurried. She launched into an explanation, admitting their affair had brought her marriage to the brink of collapse. She confessed to Paul that Landon had been home since Thursday, listening in silence as she lied during their phone conversations. She recounted how she had complained about being alone in their bed while he was in the house, hearing every word. Paul's shocked response was cut short as Evelyn detailed the moment she realized the truth. Landon had known all along. He had said nothing, quietly observing, building his case, just as he did in professional life as a negotiator. She described his ability to mask his emotions, using patience as a tool. This realization left her rattled. Paul, in disbelief, questioned how Landon could have stayed silent. Evelyn explained that he was trained to deal with liars, to remain calm and controlled until he had the upper hand. His calculated restraint had allowed him to confront her with devastating precision when she returned that morning. She admitted to Paul that her attempts to explain herself to Landon had fallen apart. She had fumbled, offering weak excuses about repaying Paul for his professional help. Even as she spoke, she had known how hollow her words sounded. Her voice cracked as she confessed the fear she felt, knowing Landon might have already connected Paul to the betrayal. Paul's concern deepened. He asked if Landon was violent. Evelyn hesitated, unsure. She mentioned his military medals, artifact of a past he rarely discussed, and admitted she had never seen him angry until now. This situation was uncharted territory for them both. She worried aloud about what might happen if Landon uncovered more of her secrets, including another affair with someone named Scott. Paul's unease turned to panic as he contemplated the potential fallout. He muttered about involving his business partners, desperate to devise a plan to deal with Landon. Their conversation trailed into tense strategizing, but for Landon, the damage was already done. Each word he overheard confirmed his fears and intensified his sense of betrayal. The silence was broken only by Evelyn's uneven breathing. Paul's voice, steady but tense, offered suggestion. Since Landon was a negotiator, perhaps he could be reasoned with. Paul suggested approaching the situation pragmatically, likening it to a legal dispute where money and discussion could potentially smooth over the damage. His idea was to involve the partnership, creating a neutral professional setting where cooler heads might prevail. Evelyn's response was sharp and incredulous. The idea of facing Landon alongside Paul and the others, the very people who had perpetuated her betrayal, seemed absurd. She was terrified of Landon's growing anger and unsure how to proceed. She admitted Landon had already begun distancing himself emotionally, doubting her and making it clear that their relationship was on precarious ground. She was desperate to salvage her marriage, but the web of lies and omission she had woven seemed impossible to untangle. As Paul continued to strategize, Landon listened in silence, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had heard. The truth was more painful than he had imagined, and the road ahead seemed impossibly long. But for now, he had the clarity he needed, and with it, the resolve to face whatever came next. Landon Barrett stood on the precipice of a life-altering decision. His marriage to Evelyn, once a cornerstone of his existence, had crumbled under the weight of betrayal and deceit. The revelations of her infidelity, compounded by the toxic culture of her law firm, Lydia and Grant, had left him reeling. But Landon was not a man to be broken easily. He was a strategist, a problem solver, and he was determined to seek justice, not just for himself, but for all those who had been exploited by the firm's corrupt practices. The campaign to dismantle Lydia and Grant began with Clare Chapman's abrupt resignation. Clare, a senior partner at the firm, had been deeply complicit in the firm's unethical FastTrack system, which coerced young associates into compromising their integrity in exchange for career advancement. But after a heart-wrenching confrontation with her husband, Victor, Clare had resolved to take a stand. She walked into Scott Reed's office, handed him her resignation letter, and delivered a scathing indictment of the firm's practices. "This is the end," she said, her voice steady but laced with anger. "The damage this firm has caused, to marriages, to lives, is unforgivable. I won't be a part of it anymore." Scott Reed, the firm's managing partner, was stunned. He tried to reason with her, but Clare was resolute. She tossed her ID badge under the receptionist's desk and walked out, signaling the end of her tenure and the beginning of the firm's downfall. With Clare's resignation, Landon launched a multi-pronged legal attack. He filed for divorce, naming Paul Reading and Scott Reed as correspondents, and pursued civil suits against the firm and its partners. His lawsuits accused him of orchestrating coerced adulterous relationships that had destroyed his marriage. Landon framed the suits as tort actions, seeking significant damages for the emotional and psychological harm he had endured. But Landon didn't stop there. Together with Clare, he filed intimate misconduct charges and petitioned the Washington State Bar Association for disciplinary action against the implicated lawyers. The firm scrambled to mount a defense, but their efforts were futile. Landon and Clare had meticulously documented their claims, and the evidence was damning. Former associates and employees began coming forward, corroborating the allegations of the firm's unethical practices. Rumors spread that Landon possessed incriminating recordings, creating a climate of fear among the partners. The firm's reputation plummeted, clients abandoned them, and associates fled. Facing a dwindling client base and mounting legal costs, Lydia and Grant was forced to shut down. Even after the firm's collapse, Landon didn't stop. He targeted individual partners, using evidence of their misconduct to negotiate settlements. He deliberately waited to see if legal actions from their spouses would drain their assets, ensuring maximum financial accountability. The fallout spread to the partners' personal lives. Catherine Reading and Valerie Reed, the wives of Paul Reading and Scott Reed, returned from Europe and filed for divorce. Both successfully secured significant portions of their husbands' remaining assets. The Washington State Bar Association reviewed the evidence provided by Landon and issued severe sanctions. Paul Reading, Scott Reed, and the remaining implicated partners were censured and disbarred for 3 years, with little hope of reinstatement. What began as a personal quest for justice turned into a reckoning that toppled one of the most prominent law firms in the state. Paul Reading and Scott Reed both realized their legal careers were irreparably over. Their divorces had drained their finances, leaving them with modest annuities that were insufficient for comfortable retirements. Paul relocated to a warmer, more affordable area, earning an income by ghostwriting legal research papers for students through an online service. However, a tipster exposed the service as a hub for academic dishonesty, and one of Paul's papers became evidence in a criminal case. Convicted of fraud, with his prior suspension from the bar factoring into his sentencing, Paul was handed a 3 to 6 year prison term. While incarcerated, he contracted a terminal illness and died of complications before completing his sentence. Scott Reed moved to Arizona and took a position as a paralegal assistant for a Native American tribal council. While he wielded more influence than a typical paralegal, his inability to practice law remained. Scott's new life, however, was uneventful and free from the turmoil that plagued Paul, largely because Clare Chapman had asked Landon to let him be. After dismantling Reed, Lydia and Grant, and ensuring the implicated partners faced consequences, Landon stepped back from his relentless quest for justice. He began working for Victor Chapman, who had reconciled with Clare as a troubleshooter and consultant. Landon streamlined Chapman Electronics, transforming it into a top-tier competitor in its industry. 3 years later, when Victor retired, he and Clare purchased a bed and breakfast on the Kitsap Peninsula. Victor sold his stake in the company to Landon, allowing him to transition into a quieter role as an overseer, delegating daily operations to younger managers. Landon never reconnected with Evelyn, who continued her career with Catherine Dunn. Eventually, Evelyn married a family friend of Dunn's and relocated to the Midwest. But the marriage ended after 3 years when she discovered her husband's affair. Moving to California to be closer to her family, Evelyn opened a small family law practice. She never remarried and carried the weight of her choices, accepting loneliness as her penance. Though she still loved Landon, she knew he would never forgive her. For several years, Landon dated casually, uninterested in forming deep attachments. That changed when he met Janice, a divorced mother of 2. After stopping to help her with a broken-down car, their connection grew,